Today I received the R86S-U4 model by Gowin Solution. This is a revision on the R86S-G4 model that they released several months ago. It has a couple interesting features that I want to go over in this review. I plan to go into more detail than my previous R86S review, which was the models that did not have 10G SFP Plus interfaces. So let's begin. This will be interesting. One of the first things I want to do is do a quick unboxing of the R86S-U4. As you can see, it comes in a plastic wrap and a nice cardboard box. I mentioned this in my last video. It actually kind of reminds me a little bit like Apple products in a nice crisp cardboard box. So let's open this up and see what's in here. Let's get this plastic wrap off. Okay. As you can see, as I open this up, it's very crisp. Wow. Okay, that's on there good. It comes with, like last time I mentioned, it comes with a little screwdriver so you can open it up because you can add an NVMe drive to it, and as well as a Wi-Fi adapter if you got the models that don't come with one and you wish to add one later. So get that out of the way. Looks like this model actually includes a power adapter that comes with a universal power plug, so you can actually change it out. This one's for a US model. But it looks like now they changed these power plugs, which is different than my last one I got, that so you can actually swap these out, I guess, depending on what country you live in. And now for the 86S itself, I dropped something, hang on. Oh, look, there's the antennas. My model, the U4, actually comes with the Wi-Fi. So it'll come with these little antennas that you can screw on the back of this box. And you can tell this is live, unscripted, because I'm dropping stuff. Not trying to be like Linus Tech Tips here, but sometimes you do drop things when you record video and not on purpose. That just kind of fell out of the box accidentally. Okay, here we go. All right, so this is the R86S-U4 model. As you can see, it has three 2.5 gigabit Ethernet interfaces and two SFP Plus interfaces on the bottom. So this one is a lot taller, as you can see. If you can see here, I have my R86Ss up here that you'll see in other videos. They're like half the thickness of this because they don't have the SFP slots. This actually is powered by USB-C. This is one of the difference with the U4 model versus the G3 model. And on the side, you'll note that there's actually an extra USB port. They added a third one that's USB 2.0, which is helpful for like keyboards and mice. You don't really need high-speed interfaces. And they changed the HDMI port to be a micro HDMI. That's one of the differences, I guess, to make a little bit more room here for the extra USB slot. They made a smaller HDMI port. So if you don't have a cable, I happen to notice that it came with this other box, and I was like, what's this other box? I almost thought it was padding at first because it was right next to the other box. But then I was like, well, it's a black box, and it came with an HDMI cable with, it's the micro HDMI to full-size HDMI port. So it already comes with a cable for you, which is nice because not everybody has a cable that has the micro HDMI. Most people have extra HDMI cables laying around, but it's nice to have the micro HDMI cable included so you don't have to go buy another cable. So that's very nice. As you can see on the back side, this is where you put your antennas if you have models that come with Wi-Fi. These come with Wi-Fi 6 and Bluetooth, some of the models. So if you have that model, you can just put this antenna on there and get Wi-Fi if you prefer to use that versus your wired interfaces, which I'm not sure how useful Wi-Fi would be when you got high-speed interfaces. The purpose of this would be you want to make use of extra bandwidth, right? Because your Wi-Fi is going to be a lot slower than even the 2.5 gigabit Ethernet interfaces. But it's nice to have that in case you need to put this somewhere where you don't have a lot of connectivity. Just gives you extra options if you need that. You might want to just get the Wi-Fi just to have the Bluetooth, right? And not use the Wi-Fi because it comes with both. Okay, on the bottom of the R86S, there is a plate on here that you can actually remove. You can add an NVMe drive in here, and it's actually PCIe 3.0 X4 interface. So you can actually take full advantage of that speed. I tested it with a fast Samsung NVMe drive a while ago and on my older R86Ss. And I was able to get full bandwidth. I did a test on my written review this time around, but I don't have as fast of an NVMe drive because I didn't really need like the fastest and greatest one. I just needed a drive, right? So it's still faster than SSD. I didn't really care about them having the maximum speed. So I put that on there. And at some point, maybe I can go back and test this, but I'm pretty sure that it should have no problems getting that full bandwidth. One thing to note about these, they are like machine tightened. So I had a hard time getting one of these screws off. I almost stripped it. So you might want to be careful when you take those off. You just have to kind of dig in and turn really hard. The R86S-U4, as you can see on the top, like you can't see it at certain angles like this angle, but if you look here, you can actually see the circular area. There's a fan here and there's some ventilation right here. And there's also another fan on the inside layer, and you can see there's some ventilation here as well. So there's one kind of internal fan and there's one on top to keep this device cool because it has 2 layers, and SFP plus interfaces typically run a lot hotter than Ethernet. So that's how they're cooling the internals of this, and it actually does pretty well. It's a little bit noisier than the P3 model that I tested, because it has 2 fans instead of 1, right? More noise a little bit, but it's not, if you had a dead silent room, you could probably hear it maybe barely across the room. But with my PC running, I can hear maybe 5 or 6 feet away. I can maybe start hearing it just a little bit. It's not an annoying sound, it's real quiet, nice fan sound. You'd probably be hard pressed to get a fanless model that has 10G, just because it generates so much heat, right? And generally you're running these on more higher performing systems as well. The fact that it has 2 fans does keep it pretty cool. So I noticed the temperatures didn't really exceed like the mid 50 degrees Celsius range, which is pretty good because I have some of these Protectly boxes and some other fanless boxes that I have. I've seen them go in the 60s and 70s degrees Celsius when it's under load. So when this device is under load, it's usually like kind of in the low to mid 50s. So the fans do a pretty good job of keeping it cool. Of course, you sacrifice complete silence, but it's probably worth it if you really want a compact, high speed, fast interface, little tiny device. One thing I always like to mention about the R86Ss is how small it is. It's actually smaller than my hand. It fits in my hand. So if you see my hand side by side, my hand is actually longer and bigger than this device. So it's actually very compact if you want something really super small, compact form factor. In comparison, I have the Protectly VP2410. Next to it, it looks like ginormous in comparison, and it's not really that big. If you think about it, I can still palm it with my hand. And I still think these boxes are really nice and compact as well, but this is ultra compact, which is kind of neat if you especially want to travel with it or just have it in a small, discrete location or something. The R86S has about a 10 watt TDP, which means that's the average wattage that's used on this device. I found using an energy monitoring plug that, especially once I had these interfaces plugged in, I was getting about 12 to 14 watts average idle usage. The SFP Plus interfaces, when I unplugged those, it seemed like it dropped about 2 watts or so, but I didn't really study that real carefully, but it does lower the power consumption when you're not using all the interfaces. And if you have like NVMe drive, those sorts of things, anytime you add something to it, it actually increases the power consumption. I noticed this peaked at about 25 or 6 watts of power usage under load, so it definitely uses a little bit more power than the other R86Ss that I have. But still, it's pretty good because on average, it's like hovering at like 12, 13, 14, 15 watts, something like that. The 10 gigabit SFP Plus interfaces are not enabled in OPNsense by default. So I figured out using a guide I found online actually that you can actually enable the kernel level module drivers for the Mellanox 10 gigabit SFP interfaces. So if one way you can do this is via SSH. So if you SSH into your OPNsense box, let me type in my secret password. And so I'm logging in as root. So I'll have the menu here and just hit 8 to go to the shell. So if you type in EE, you can use that editor, or you can use VI if you're one of those people like VI. I don't really like Vim or VI, whichever you want to call it, very much. So you can use EE as another text editor. That's kind of a basic editor. And if you go to /boot/loader.conf.local, you have to make sure you use .local because .conf loader.conf does exist, but it's automatically generated, so it gets overridden. So if you want your settings to be saved, you need to make sure you do loader.conf.local and hit enter, and you're going to enter this one line into this file called mlx4en underscore load equals, and then yes in parentheses. And this is all you need to do to load your module. You hit escape, and then hit leave editor, and since I didn't have any changes, it won't prompt me to save any changes. But if you are just typing it in, you have to enter twice, and the second time to be able to get that to save that file. And then all you have to do is reboot your OPNsense, and then you'll be able to see your 10 gigabit interfaces. So it's not too bad as long as you know how to go into the command line and tweak a file. It's actually not very difficult to enable. Now let's look at the performance of the network interfaces. We'll start with the 10G SFP plus interfaces because I'm sure that's what most people are interested in. And I found out a couple interesting things while doing this testing. So first of all, you want to make sure when you first install OPNsense, you'll notice there's options for Netflow, which gives you some different statistics and different things you can look at. You might want to have this disabled if you're going to use the 10 gigabit interfaces, because I noticed it actually dropped the throughput of the 10G interfaces. And that's why I was wondering why I couldn't get the full throughput, because I know basic routing does not really require a ton of resources. You're not doing any IDS, IPS, or VPN type traffic. It's very CPU intensive. I just want to make sure that's up front, that I have that disabled so you can get maximum performance here in our test. The first test I'm going to do is actually, I'm going to leave the default MTU set to 1500, which is what all the interfaces default to, and in network interfaces in general, not just OPNsense. So we're going to run the test here. I have a window open here, a console window, and I'm going to show you just the raw performance of routing across two different, both of the 10G interfaces. And I have the firewall rules set to allow all, which I can show you here while that's running. You can see my firewall rules here if I click them, and then you can see I have on my network interfaces, I'm allowing all and allowing all, so that way traffic can get between the two interfaces here. So we go back to the dashboard, and you can see the CPU usage it seems like it's using mostly one core here. I messed with some tunables, and it didn't seem to affect performance too much. As you can see, I'm getting about 8.2, 8.3 gigabits per second, which is pretty good raw speed, considering we don't have the MTU set any higher. If the MTU is set to 1500 and you enable Netflow, I want to show actually how much performance you lose when you enable this, because I haven't enabled all the other interfaces. So I'm just going to go ahead and hit apply, and then we'll just go back to the dashboard so you can see the CPU usage there. Now watch, when I run this, I was getting 8.3 gigabits per second, and now it's going to drop to, give it a few seconds, it's going to drop to 5.39. Sometimes I've had it go to like 6.8, up to 6.8, 6.9, but right now it's actually running at 5.3, 5.4 gigabits or so. So it's actually pretty terrible, right? And so that's why if I go in here, and I'll just show you if I turn it off, how much better performance actually is. This is only when MTU set to 1500, and as I'll demonstrate later, when an MTU set to 9000, it actually is fine because there's less data packets to process, and it seems like it's a lighter load actually on the system. So that's kind of interesting. But anyway, let's run this again and see what happens. Go back to the dashboard here, just for fun. You see how it's kind of pegging out one CPU here, 25%. You see how I turned it off, and now we're getting back up to our 8.2 to 3 that we were getting before. Yeah, so it's back to normal now because I turned off Netflow. So it actually can have up to 2.5 gigabit per second drop. But I noticed 1.4 gigabit drop when I tested it earlier, and that's what I actually wrote about in my written guide. Okay, now we're going to test the MTU set to 9000 to see what differences has on the performance of our 10G interfaces. So I want to show you real quick what I did to configure this. If you look on my interfaces, I have one called Fast 1, Fast 2 for my 10G interfaces. As you can see on Fast 1, you can see that have the MTU set to 9,000. I have the same thing set on the Fast 2. If you scroll down, it's 9,000 is where you set the MTU. I'm using Linux, Kubuntu to be exact. And so if I go to my interface properties here, I can look at the MTU. I can actually set it to 9,000 as well. And I also did that on my TrueNAS. I won't show you where the settings are on that, but you get the idea. You basically configure every interface that is going to be using jumbo frames. You set it to 9,000. And then I'll go to the reporting. Let's go to the live traffic stats here of my Fast 1, Fast 2 interface. I have showing here so you can see the incoming and outgoing of each interface. And I'm going to run this test again. And we're going to see what performance we get. Hopefully we get close to 10G, right? So as you can see, like it goes right up to 10G and it just stays pegged at 10G the whole time, which is really awesome. So with the network overhead, you're going to get like 9.8, 9.9 gigabits per second. That's the max pretty much theoretical you can get with this. So you're going to see like some good performance here. So this means that you can actually route full 10G across the interfaces if you don't have IDS, IPS, or VPNs or any of that sorts of things happening across those interfaces. If you're just doing raw routing, with nothing, it'll actually handle that, which is actually really great. So you can see I got 9.8 gigabits per second for that transfer. So I just wanted to show that it is possible with this to get that. And let's look at the dashboard and run this again real quick and see like. I'm just checking out the CPU usage, see if it's similar to the MTU 1500. So the interesting thing is here so far, it actually looks like the CPU usage is actually a little bit less than the MTU of 1500. That seems to peg out one of the cores more, because if you think about it, there's a lot more data packets, right? Because MTU 1500 was 6 times more at least data packets if you multiply that out. So that's why I mentioned when you had MTU set to 1500, when you watch the traffic graph, it actually decreases the throughput because it's actually pegging out that at least one of those cores more, because there's a lot more data packets coming through when you have the lower MTU set, because you're not using larger data packets. And so the performance is actually worse, when you're using a lower MTU, of course. So I thought that was a very interesting thing to point out. Just the mere act of viewing the traffic under the traffic graph, even if Netflow is disabled, actually lowers the throughput even more. So it doesn't seem to do that actually with MTU set to 9,000. You actually watch the traffic graph. So interesting thing is I have Netflow enabled with the MTU set to 9,000, and it actually doesn't negatively affect performance like it does with MTU set to 1500. So if you actually are running the MTU at 9,000, you can actually enable Netflow for those 10 gigabit interfaces and not impact performance. So I thought that's kind of interesting. You can view the traffic graph, you can view Netflow. There's a lot less data packets coming in because they're larger data packets. So you can actually, this box can handle it. It can't handle the lower MTU with Netflow enabled or watching the traffic graph. That's the interesting thing about digging into this stuff and figuring out what this box is capable of doing. Because if you had a higher performing system, MTU 1500 is probably not going to be that big a deal, right? So you just have to keep in mind those little gotchas with having a lower power, more energy efficient system. You're going to run into these little things where you need to keep in mind if you want to have maximum performance. So now let's test the 10 gigabit interface with Zenarmor. I have it enabled on both interfaces. I'm going to run a speed test and see what we get to see how it limits performance. Notice we have the MTU set to 1500, which is the default because we can't run it with MTU 9000 for jumbo frames because Zenarmor will actually complain about it. So that means we're already lowering bandwidth down to like 7.8 to 8.2 or whatever, around 8 gigabits. So we're already losing 1 gigabit from using a lower MTU, which sends more data packets. And now with Zenarmor, it lowers it even further, of course, with IDS, IPS, with this CPU being limited. I've noticed here, I'll show you in a second, but I think this is one of those cases where when I've noticed when you have the MTU set to 1500 on the 10 gigabit interfaces, it's because it's sending more data packets. The fact that it's doing that because the data packets are smaller, the act of viewing the traffic graph actually lowers the bandwidth. See how the performance looks better, it's starting off better. 3.4, 3.6, then it kind of drops after the initial burst there. I'm not sure why it does that, but and then it kind of settles in at about 3 gigabits average. So the traffic graph itself actually slows down the throughput a little bit. It lowers the throughput, so it's kind of interesting that it actually does that, because that tells you we're hitting the limitations. As you can see, the CPU usage is at 50%. We're maxing out 2 cores on the system. So if once they get that to be more multi-threaded, perhaps the bandwidth here will improve over time. I think that'll be a little bit more of a game changer for these mini PC firewalls, because you can't even take advantage of the full CPU of these mini PCs. Now I'm going to test a 10 gigabit Ethernet interface to see what impact Suricata has on it. So let's go ahead and run that test. I enabled it just on one interface to simulate the WAN interface as being enabled with Suricata. So we'll see what that looks like. So it looks like we're sitting at about 900 megabits per second. So that gives you a general idea of how much impact the performance will have with Suricata on the 10 gigabit interface. It's actually less than 1 gigabit per second is what you'll get. So that's why I recommend not using IDS or IPS on the 10 gigabit interface. Zenarmor does a lot better, but it still only gets you 3 gigabits. Now we're going to test the 2.5 gigabit Ethernet interfaces. Let's open up the my console window here. I have another R86S, a second one that I set up with iPerf. So now I'm testing across the 2.5 gigabit Ethernet interfaces, and I already did the 10 gigabit across both those interfaces. So as we can see here in a few seconds, we should be able to get full 2.5 gigabit speeds without any issues. There's a little bit of network overhead, so you'll get about 2.3 gigabits per second, like as you can see. No problem getting that speed. I noticed it too if you turn on Netflow as well. There's no degradation to the throughput. Just for the fun of it, I'm going to test 2.5 gigabit connection along with the 10 gigabit connection at the same time to see if the speed can keep up between the two machines. Remember, I'm just doing pure routing. I don't have anything, but it's still going across the normal PF firewall, across each interface, because they're not bridged together, so they're treated as separate interface and networks, right? So I'm going to run them at the same time. I'm going to start the 2.5 gigabit test and the 10 gigabit test, and we'll see what happens. Since we're not doing anything super CPU intensive, I expect we should still get pretty good performance here. As you can see, 2.3 gigabits and 9.8, 9.9. So there's no impact there. So you can have a lot of network traffic as long as you're not doing a lot of monitoring and IDS, IPS type stuff, which is more computationally intensive. So that's pretty cool. We can see we have data going across 4 interfaces essentially, right? Between 4 different machines. We're going to test the 2.5 gigabit Ethernet interface with Zenarmor to see how it is affected. Let's get started. Got it enabled on both interfaces. I've noticed it kind of starts off a little bit slow, and it kind of ramps up over time. You see how it starts off, kind of dips down, and then it settles in at 2.5 gigabits up there. So it's kind of interesting because when you're doing iPerf tests, you're getting the average. So it's kind of it seems to do this a lot. It'll do it once, do a big dip, and then it'll dip again, and then after that second dip, and it seems like after 30 seconds or so, I don't know, it's kind of getting warmed up, I guess. I don't know, it's just like after 30 seconds, it seems like it settles in at about full 2.5 gigabit speeds. So you might take a slight hit, but a little bit below like the raw speed of 2.5 gigabit Ethernet interface, which is kind of interesting because I didn't see that fluctuation quite as much on the 10 gigabit interfaces. So not quite sure what's happening there exactly, but as you can see, the last couple, after the last 30 seconds of this 1 minute run, actually had pretty much full bandwidth. But the average is a little bit below, the 2.3 maximum throughput gigabits per second. Now we're going to test the 2.5 gigabit Ethernet interfaces with Suricata enabled on just one of the interfaces to simulate Suricata being on the WAN interface, and we'll see what kind of performance we get. Okay, just in a few seconds here, we'll get to see what performance we're expecting. It should be near 1 gigabit because when I ran it on a slower CPU, similar, it was about 800 to 900 megabits. So as you can see here, we're getting about 1 gigabits per second. So if you're going to run Suricata on one of the interfaces, on the 2.5 gigabit Ethernet interfaces, you'll get slightly over 1 gigabit because normally you get like 900 and some megabits, like 920, 30, 40 megabits to max out 1 gigabit. So you can actually get slightly more than 1 gigabit if you count the overhead, network overhead. So that's cuts your bandwidth in at least a little more than half when you're using these interfaces with Suricata. So it kind of gives you a general idea like the performance hit you'll expect.